In 1860, roughly half the millionaires in the entire United States lived in one place. Not New York, not Boston, not Philadelphia. They lived in a town of fewer than 6,000 free residents, perched on a bluff 200 feet above the Mississippi River in the southwestern corner of Mississippi. The town was called Natchez. And on the eve of the war that would destroy everything they had built, these millionaires did something that almost nobody in Mississippi did. They voted against secession. They saw what was coming. They understood, in precise financial terms, what a war would cost them. And then, when the war came anyway, the richest of them did something even more remarkable. They packed their bags, moved to New York, and sent the Confederacy a bill. That story, a city so wealthy it defied belief, built by people who never fully belonged to it, destroyed by a war its own citizens tried to prevent, is the story of Natchez. And at the southern edge of town, there is still a house that tells the whole thing without saying a word. It is 6 stories tall, octagonal, crowned with a Byzantine dome, surrounded by white-columned verandas. From the outside, it looks like the most magnificent residence in the South. Step through the front door, and you find bare brick, naked timber, rusting tools on the floor where Philadelphia craftsmen dropped them the week the shooting started. The house is called Longwood. The locals have always called it Nuts Folly. It is the most visited house in Natchez, and it has never been finished. But before Longwood, before Cotton, before the millionaires, there was the bluff. The Natchez bluff is a wall of less, fine, wind-deposited soil, pale and powdery, rising sharply from the eastern bank of the Mississippi. Stand on its edge, and you can see the river bending south toward New Orleans, the Louisiana flatlands stretching to the horizon, and the tiny town of Vidalia across the water. The Natchez people, an indigenous civilization with a sophisticated hierarchy of rulers they called sons, had built their grand village near this bluff for centuries. The French arrived in 1716 and established Fort Rosalie on it. The British took it in 1763 after the 7 Years' War. The Spanish held it for 2 decades after that. And in 1798, when American forces under Captain Isaac Guillon finally accepted the Spanish surrender, the United States Congress made Natchez the first capital of the brand-new Mississippi Territory. 4 flags in 80 years. Each new power looked at that bluff and reached the same conclusion. Whoever controlled this high ground controlled the river. The river was everything. In the early 19th century, before railroads existed, the Mississippi was the interstate highway system of the American interior. Every bushel of grain, every barrel of pork, every bale of cotton grown anywhere between the Appalachians and the Rockies eventually floated past Natchez on its way to New Orleans and the world. The bluff gave Natchez something almost no other river town possessed: elevation. Floods that swallowed landing after landing along the lower Mississippi never reached the streets of Natchez proper. Wealthy people could build permanent homes up top, confident that the river would not take them, while the commerce of the frontier churned 200 feet below. And that commerce created a split personality that defined the town for decades. The first steamboat to dock at the Natchez waterfront was the New Orleans, piloted by Nicholas Roosevelt in 1811. The same year, the New Madrid earthquake reshaped the riverbed upstream. Before steamboats, flatboats and keelboats carried goods downriver on one-way trips. The crews then walked home along the Natchez Trace, the ancient overland trail stretching 444 miles to Nashville. Natchez sat at the southern terminus of this trail, which meant every boatman heading home passed through town with cash in his pocket and weeks of river labor behind him. What they found waiting for them at the base of the bluff along a muddy strip called Silver Street was a neighborhood so lawless that visitors gave it a separate name: Natchez Under the Hill. One writer called the two halves Natchez Proper and Natchez Improper. A traveler passing through in 1810 called the landing, for its size, perhaps the most dissipated spot on earth. Flatboatmen, river pirates, card sharks, and prostitutes filled the taverns and gambling dens that lined the waterfront. Saloons, hotels, warehouses, a coal yard, an ice house, a quarter-mile horse track, and even a 10-pin bowling alley crowded into the flat ground between the river and the cliff. Newcomers who wandered down Silver Street after dark were sometimes clubbed and robbed, their bodies thrown into the current. Up on the bluff, the same week, a planter's wife might be hosting a dinner party with French wine and imported silver. This was not a contradiction, it was the business model. The respectability on top needed the roughness at the bottom, because the flatboats and steamboats docking under the hill were carrying the goods that made everything above possible. Then came cotton, and the business model became an empire. Eli Whitney's cotton gin, patented in 1793, turned a crop that had been expensive to process into the most profitable commodity on earth. The fertile, less soils around Natchez proved ideal for growing it. British textile mills in Manchester and Liverpool developed a seemingly limitless appetite for raw fiber, and American cotton exports surged to meet the demand. By the 1850s, cotton accounted for more than half of all American export earnings. Mississippi alone produced 20% of the world's supply. And the Natchez district, the cluster of counties surrounding the city, sat at the center of it all. Cotton grown on the vast plantations along the river was ginned, baled, loaded onto steamboats at Natchez or nearby landings, floated to New Orleans, and shipped to Liverpool. The money flowed back up the same route and pooled on the bluff. But the cotton could not be grown without labor, and the labor system that made Natchez rich was slavery on an industrial scale. By 1860, enslaved people comprised roughly 70% of Adams County's total population. 14,292 enslaved individuals against fewer than 6,000 free whites. The city operated the second largest slave market in the United States, trailing only New Orleans. It was called the Forks of the Road, located at the intersection of three main routes into town, about a mile east of downtown. After an 1833 city ordinance barred the sale of enslaved people within city limits, a decision driven partly by concerns about appearances among the Natchez elite, the market moved to this junction and expanded rapidly. The professional slave-trading firm of Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, the most active in the country, established operations at the Forks. Franklin ran the Natchez and New Orleans end. Armfield managed the supply from their slave pen in Alexandria, Virginia. Enslaved people walked the entire distance overland in coffles, chained groups, from the declining tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake to the booming cotton frontier of the Deep South. Tens of thousands passed through the forks of the road between 1833 and 1863. The wealth this system generated is difficult to comprehend in modern terms. The men who accumulated it were called the Natchez Nabobs, and their story confounds nearly every assumption about the antebellum South. Most of them were not Southern. They were transplanted Northerners, Europeans, and cosmopolitan entrepreneurs who had come to the Mississippi frontier to make fortunes and succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. Consider Stephen Duncan. Born in Carlisle, Pennsylvania in 1787, Duncan studied medicine and moved to the Mississippi Territory at age 21. He married into the local elite. His second wife was a Binghamton, one of the old Natchez families, and quickly discovered that planting cotton was far more lucrative than practicing medicine. By the 1850s, Duncan owned more than 15 plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana, controlled roughly 43,000 acres, and held over 2,000 enslaved people, making him the second largest slaveholder in the United States. His plantations yielded annual returns of $150,000, a staggering sum when a skilled laborer might earn $400 a year. He served as president of the Bank of the State of Mississippi for nearly 2 decades. He invested his cotton profits in northern railroads, government bonds, and New York banks. He sold his crop through merchants in New Orleans who forwarded it to agents in Liverpool, and the revenue flowed into his accounts at Charles P. Leverich and Company in Manhattan. Duncan was, in every meaningful sense, a national capitalist who happened to operate from a bluff in Mississippi. He was not alone. Francis Serget, the son of a French sea captain, had settled near Natchez in 1785 and built an estate that included a dozen plantations, 1,300 enslaved people, and a fortune valued in the millions. Levin Marshall, another planter financier, held comparable assets. Of the 71 Mississippi planters who owned more than 250 enslaved people during the 1850s, 55 of them, 71%, lived in Natchez and its immediate surroundings. These men were connected not just by geography, but by a dense web of intermarriage and joint investments in land, banks, slaves, ships, and railroads. They bought their chandeliers from France, their marble from Italy, their mahogany from Honduras. They sent their children to schools in the North and their wives to shop in Philadelphia. And they built houses that were meant to announce in stone and plaster and hand-carved wood that this bluff above the Mississippi River was the richest ground in America. The nabobs were connected to one another and to the world in ways that made Natchez feel less like a small southern town and more like a node in a global financial network. Duncan sold his cotton through Washington Jackson and Company in New Orleans, who forwarded it to their subsidiary, Todd Jackson and Company in Liverpool. The revenue was then routed to his bank in Manhattan. A single bale of Natchez cotton might generate transactions on 3 continents before the planter saw his profit. And the profit was enormous. In the 1850s, cotton accounted for more than half of all American exports by value. The fiber that left Natchez Landing traveled to English mills that turned it into cloth that was sold in markets from London to Calcutta. This was not a provincial agricultural economy. It was an engine of global capitalism, and its operators understood that perfectly well. Not everyone on the bluff was white, or wealthy, or free. Natchez had the largest community of free people of color in Mississippi before the war, 225 in 1860, in a state where the entire free black population was only 773. The most famous of them was William Johnson, a barber who had been born into slavery around 1809 and emancipated as a child. Johnson trained in the trade, opened a barber shop in Natchez, and eventually expanded into a bathhouse, a bookstore, and substantial land holdings. He kept a diary from 1835 until his murder in 1851, the single richest surviving source on free black life in the antebellum South. Johnson recorded everything: business transactions, weather, court cases, horse races, cockfights, political campaigns, epidemics, parades, fashion, and the daily texture of a city where free and enslaved black people lived in a variety of economic circumstances alongside whites who ranged from millionaire planters to drunken flatboatmen. On June 21, 1841, finding nothing remarkable to report, he wrote simply, "Nothing new this morning that is worth the attention of a smart man." His barber shop was a clearinghouse for Natchez gossip, and his diary preserves a city that was far more complicated, more layered, more contradictory, more human than the mansions alone would suggest. The houses still stand. That is the strange part. Natchez today has more surviving antebellum homes than any other city in the United States, over 500 structures, many listed on the National Register of Historic Places. They survived because Natchez surrendered, but that comes later. First, consider what was built. Auburn, completed in 1812, was the first house in the Mississippi Territory to feature a classical 2-story columned portico. It became the architectural prototype that spread across the South. Rosalie, a Georgian-style mansion named after the old French fort, sat right on the bluff overlooking the river, its rooms filled with the kind of imported furniture that had to travel thousands of miles upriver by steamboat. Melrose, built in the 1840s, was surrounded by formal gardens, slave quarters, and outbuildings that together formed a self-contained estate within walking distance of downtown. Dunleith, rebuilt in 1856 after a fire, was wrapped on all four sides by 26 Tuscan columns, a full perimeter colonnade that made it look less like a house and more like a Roman temple that had wandered into Mississippi by accident. And then there was Stanton Hall. Frederick Stanton was an Irish immigrant who came to America in 1815, worked as a physician, and made a fortune as a cotton broker and planter controlling more than 16,000 acres. In 1851, he purchased an entire city block in downtown Natchez for the sum of $1,550 and commissioned a local builder named Thomas Rose to construct a Greek Revival mansion on it. The house took 6 years to build and cost over $83,000 before furnishing, a figure equivalent to several $1 million today. Stanton imported Carrara marble for the floors, mahogany for the doors, each 2.5 inches thick, bronze chandeliers from France, Italian statuary, and Sheffield silver hardware. The double parlors featured floor-to-ceiling pier mirrors that created the illusion of infinite space. An April 1858 newspaper described the finished product as one of the most magnificent and princely residences of Natchez. Frederick Stanton moved in. He originally named the house Belfast after his Irish homeland. He lived in it for 1 month. Then yellow fever killed him. He was 65. Stanton Hall was not unusual in its ambition. It was unusual only in the bluntness of its irony. A man spends 6 years and a fortune building the house of his dreams, names it after the home he left behind, and dies before the season changes. But the city was full of such stories. Natchez in the 1850s was a place where enormous wealth existed alongside enormous fragility. Yellow fever epidemics, the constant threat of river flooding, the periodic financial panics that could wipe out a planter overnight, and underneath everything, the awareness that the entire economy rested on a single crop and a single system of labor. The great Natchez tornado of May 7, 1840, had demonstrated just how quickly everything could be taken. The morning began sultry and overcast, with a dusty haze over the river and a continuous rumble of thunder that lasted for hours. By early afternoon, the sky had turned so dark that residents lit candles in their dining rooms. The funnel, estimated today as an F4 or F5, nearly a mile wide, tore up the river from the southwest and hit Natchez Landing with a force that witnesses compared to all the cannons of Austerlitz. Of the 120 flatboats docked at the waterfront, 116 sank. The river rose 10 to 15 feet in seconds, whipped into waves so violent that even experienced swimmers could not stay on the surface. The steamboat Prairie went down with its cargo of lead. The steamboat Hines was ripped loose and floated downstream to Baton Rouge, where rescuers found 51 bodies aboard. A piece of a steamboat window was reportedly recovered 30 miles from the river. On land, the air was black with whirling eddies of walls, roofs, chimneys, and timbers from distant ruins. 12 city blocks were completely destroyed. 2 churches, a theater, the town square, hotels, homes. The official death toll was 317, with only 109 injured, a ratio that speaks to the storm's terrifying intensity. Most of the dead were on the river. An estimated 200 boatmen drowned. The actual number was almost certainly higher because enslaved people killed in the storm were not consistently counted. Natchez rebuilt. It always rebuilt. The cotton economy was too powerful, the location too advantageous, and the money too plentiful for a tornado to end things. By 1860, Adams County ranked at or near the top of every county in the United States in per capita wealth. The 1860 census would become the high water mark, the moment against which everything after would be measured. It was in that moment, the absolute peak, that Haller Nutt decided to build the grandest house in Mississippi. Nutt was born in 1816 on Laurel Hill Plantation in Jefferson County, educated at the University of Virginia, and had built a personal fortune estimated at more than $3 million. He owned nearly 43,000 acres and 800 enslaved people across plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana. In 1860 alone, his agricultural operations netted him over $228,000 in profit. His wife, Julia, had always loved Natchez, and in 1850, Nutt had purchased 86 acres at the southern edge of town as a gift to her. Now, in late 1859, he wrote to Samuel Sloan, a prominent Philadelphia architect, expressing interest in an octagonal house design that Sloan had published in his 1852 pattern book, The Model Architect. Sloan had labeled the design an Oriental Villa. He had never expected anyone to actually build it. Nutt wanted to build it. 6 stories, 32 rooms, 8 verandas, a central rotunda rising through the entire structure to a Moorish cupola with a Byzantine onion dome. 115 doors, 25 fireplaces, 32,000 square feet. The estimated cost, including furnishings, was $200,000, roughly $35 million today. It would be the largest octagonal house in the United States, and quite possibly in the world. Construction began in the spring of 1860. Sloan sent a crew of skilled craftsmen from Philadelphia to do the finish work. The bricks were made locally. The design blended Italianate, Moorish, and classical elements into something that looked like nothing else in the South, or anywhere in America for that matter. Through 1860 and into 1861, the exterior walls rose, the dome took shape, the verandas were framed. By September 1861, the exterior was substantially complete. The roof was on, the dome was finished, the building was recognizable as the extraordinary thing Sloan had drawn. And then the Philadelphia workers put down their tools and went home. The secession crisis had been building for months. On January 9, 1861, the Mississippi Secession Convention voted to leave the Union. The delegates from Adams County, from Natchez, voted against. It was not a close call for them. The Natchez nabobs had more to lose than almost anyone in the South. Their fortunes were entangled with northern banks, northern railroads, northern industry. They had family in the North. They could read a balance sheet, and a balance sheet said that a war with the industrial North was financial suicide. Adams and Warren counties were the only 2 counties in Mississippi with the pragmatism, or the self-interest, to vote no. Mississippi seceded anyway. The Philadelphia craftsmen at Longwood could read the news as well as anyone. By the fall of 1861, with fighting underway and travel between North and South increasingly dangerous, they left. Their tools, saws, planes, paintbrushes, buckets of nails, remained where they had set them down on the upper floors. They are still there today. Between February and July of 1862, Haller Nutt used his own enslaved laborers to finish the basement level of Longwood. 8 rooms were plastered, floored, and furnished. The Nutt family moved in. They would live in the basement of the grandest unfinished house in America. Meanwhile, the war that the nabobs had tried to prevent arrived at their doorstep. And then, in a twist that only Natchez could produce, it barely touched them. On May 12, 1862, after the fall of New Orleans, Natchez surrendered to Flag Officer David Farragut's forces without a fight. There was no battle. There was no siege. The Union simply arrived, and the city opened its gates. A Union ironclad later shelled the town from the river, killing a young girl named Rosalie Beekman and an elderly man who died of a heart attack at the sound of the guns. Those were essentially the only civilian casualties of the war in Natchez. After the fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, Union troops under General Thomas Ransom occupied the city and set up headquarters at the mansion called Rosalie. The same Rosalie named after the old French fort, now serving its 4th flag. The mansion survived, the columns still stood, the chandeliers still hung. Natchez was physically intact, and this fact, This accident of early surrender and a Union command that chose not to destroy what it found is the reason Natchez looks the way it does today. Vicksburg was besieged for 47 days. Atlanta was burned. Much of the South was wrecked. Natchez was spared. But being spared the war's destruction did not mean being spared its consequences. The richest nabobs had already gone. Stephen Duncan, perhaps the wealthiest man in the city, departed in the spring of 1863. Before leaving, he presented the Confederate government with a bill for $185,000 to compensate him for wartime losses. Losses he blamed entirely on the act of secession he had voted against. He moved to New York and never came back to live permanently. At least 4 other prominent nabobs did the same. The men who had built Natchez into the richest city in America walked away from it when the investment went bad. The men who could not walk away fared worse. Haller Nutt had been a Unionist. He had opposed secession. He had expected, perhaps naively, that his loyalty would protect his property. It did not. In the fall of 1863, Union armies devastated his Louisiana plantations, causing him documented losses of $1,020,540.07. Confederate forces had already burned approximately 2,000 bales of his cotton to keep it from falling into Union hands. The cotton that remained could not be sold. The Union blockade had choked Southern ports to a fraction of pre-war volume. Nutt's cash flow collapsed. Foreclosure proceedings began on his Louisiana properties. The man who had netted $228,000 in a single year was now unable to pay his debts. On June 15, 1864, Haller Nutt died of pneumonia in the basement of Longwood. He was 48 years old. Some who knew him said he died of a broken heart. His wife, Julia, remained in the house with their children, tending the rose gardens, 15 acres of them, and growing vegetables in the orchard to feed her family. She lived in those 8 basement rooms until her death in 1897. Their son, Sergeant Prentice Knute, later became a lawyer and spent years lobbying the federal government for compensation. The government eventually paid the Nutt estate less than $100,000. The upper floors of Longwood were never finished. The end of the Civil War did not destroy Natchez. It did something more insidious. It removed the conditions that had made the city's extraordinary wealth possible, while leaving the city itself standing as a monument to what was gone. Emancipation eliminated the forced labor system on which the entire cotton economy had been built. Cotton continued to be grown, but under sharecropping arrangements that generated nothing like the antebellum returns. The great plantations fragmented. The nabob's fortunes, those built on the intertwined assets of land, enslaved people, and cotton, evaporated. An enslaved person worth $1,500 on the Natchez market in 1860 was, after emancipation, a free citizen owed wages. The arithmetic of the old economy simply ceased to function. Reconstruction brought a brief, remarkable political transformation. In 1870, Hiram R. Revels of Natchez became the first African-American seated in the United States Congress, serving as a U.S. Senator. Mississippi had just been readmitted to the Union. The same city that had hosted the South's second-largest slave market now sent a black minister to occupy the Senate seat that Jefferson Davis had vacated. It did not last. Within a decade, white supremacist violence and legal maneuvering would dismantle black political power across Mississippi for nearly a century. And then the river, which had given Natchez everything, stopped mattering as much. Natchez had never successfully connected itself to the railroad network. There had been one attempt before the war, the Natchez and Hamburg Railroad, launched in the 1830s with grand ambitions to link the city to the Pearl River. Construction began with as many as 800 enslaved laborers grading the track bed. Then the panic of 1837 hit. The railroad's finances collapsed. The track got somewhere between 20 and 35 miles out of town before the whole enterprise was abandoned. The railroad and its associated bank went into receivership. So ended the only attempt before the Civil War to tie Natchez into the modern transportation network. One historian noted that the city's isolation from this new mode of freight and passengers would be sorely felt as the decades passed. It was. As railroads expanded through Mississippi in the late 19th century, the major lines ran through Jackson, Meridian, and other inland cities. Natchez, stuck on its bluff at the river's edge, was bypassed. The commerce that had once flowed through the city on steamboats now moved by rail through towns that had barely existed during the cotton boom. The Mississippi River remained important, but it was no longer the nation's central artery. The advantages that geography had given Natchez, the bluff, the landing, the strategic position on the river, became irrelevant in a railroad age. The city did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It subsided. The population, which had been stagnant even during the boom years — Adams County had roughly the same number of free whites in 1860 as it had in 1840 — never grew the way other Mississippi cities did. Natchez had been the largest city in Mississippi before the war. It would not hold that distinction long. The 20th century brought a succession of partial recoveries and further setbacks. The boll weevil arrived around 1907 and devastated cotton yields throughout the region. An oil boom in the 1930s brought temporary relief. The city's voters approved a $300,000 bond issue to lure Armstrong Tire and Rubber Company in 1939, offering 5 years of free rent and a 45-year lease at $3,600 a year, plus an exemption from local taxes. The factory eventually employed over 1,000 workers, many of them black residents who had been displaced from agricultural work. It was, by the standards of Mississippi's Balance Agriculture with Industry program, a success story. But the Garden Club women of Natchez were not sure what to make of it. An ugly, sprawling, belching factory, 3 stories high and the length of 2.5 football fields, sitting within the city limits. It did not fit with the Old South image they were cultivating. Armstrong was eventually bought by Titan International and closed in 2001. International Paper in Johns Manville came after World War II, large enough to require the city's first comprehensive plan in 1951. They, too, eventually declined or departed. And through it all, the old houses kept standing. On an April evening in 1940, while the mansions sat in their quiet gardens on the bluff, something happened in Natchez that most Americans have never heard of. The Rhythm Nightclub, a converted blacksmith shop on St. Catherine Street, had booked Walter Barnes and his Royal Creolians, a popular swing band from Chicago. Barnes was a Natchez native. This was his homecoming show. Nearly 500 people crowded into the long, narrow, corrugated metal building. The windows had been boarded shut to keep out anyone who hadn't paid admission. The interior was decorated with Spanish moss, some of it reportedly sprayed with insecticide. There were only 2 doors, both near the front. One was locked. Around 11:30 p.m., a discarded cigarette, or perhaps a flame from the hamburger stand near the entrance, ignited the moss. The fire spread through the wooden interior in seconds. The single available door opened inward against the crush of panicked bodies. Barnes and his band kept playing, trying to calm the crowd, until the fire took them too. 209 people died. Every victim was black. Nearly every black family in Natchez lost someone. Survivors reported hearing screams across the entire city. It was the 4th deadliest club fire in American history, deadlier than the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, and it was barely covered by the white national press. The Chicago Defender, the country's leading black newspaper, reported that more than 15,000 people attended Barnes's funeral. In Natchez itself, the tragedy existed in a separate world from the pilgrimage tourists who came each spring to admire the antebellum parlors. The pilgrimage, that was the invention that saved what was left. In March 1932, at the bottom of the Great Depression, the Natchez Garden Club invited fellow garden clubs from across the South for a series of tours and luncheons on the grounds of the town's grand old estates. Most of these homes had been deteriorating for decades. Their owners could not afford to maintain them. When rain forced the cancellation of the outdoor garden tour on the second day, several homeowners, perhaps out of simple Southern hospitality, invited the visitors inside. It was, by all accounts, an unexpected revelation. A woman from Virginia reportedly said that her state had beautiful homes too, but in Virginia you had to drive miles between them. In Natchez, they were all within walking distance of each other, block after block of Greek Revival and Federal and Italianate mansions, the most concentrated collection of antebellum architecture in America. Catherine Grafton Miller, the club's organizer, recognized what she had. She promoted the pilgrimage nationally, and it became an annual event that drew thousands, then tens of thousands of visitors. The tourism revenue helped stabilize the local economy during the Depression and, more importantly, provided the financial incentive to restore and maintain the houses. The irony of this is worth sitting with. The mansions were built with the profits of cotton and slavery. The cotton economy collapsed. The mansions began to rot. And then the mansions themselves became the product, the thing that generated revenue and kept the city alive. Natchez had lost its cotton, its river trade, its railroads, its factories. What it had left were the physical remnants of the world that was gone. The city's greatest asset turned out to be its own past. Today, Natchez has a population of about 14,500. Adams County's population has been declining at roughly 1% a year. Tourism generates over $126 million annually for the county and supports nearly 1,500 jobs. But the city grapples with the same challenges facing small towns across the rural South: population loss, limited economic diversification, aging infrastructure. The Natchez-Adams County port has seen a resurgence, shipping lumber, steel, and petroleum products down the river to global markets. And there are those who see in this a quiet echo of the old river economy. The city is roughly 73% black, a demographic inversion of the antebellum era, when black people made up the majority of the population but owned nothing. The Forks of the Road is a small triangular patch of grass between St. Catherine and Franklin Streets, marked by historical plaques. The slave pens are long gone. Where tens of thousands of human beings were bought and sold, there is now a memorial and an intersection. Silver Street, the old gauntlet of Natchez under the hill, has a couple of restaurants, a gift shop, and the Under the Hill Saloon. The Isle of Capri, a riverboat casino that operated for 2 decades, closed in 2015. A few restored brick buildings remain from the era when the waterfront was the most dangerous spot on the river. Stanton Hall, still called Belfast by no one, is the headquarters of the Pilgrimage Garden Club. You can walk through Frederick Stanton's double parlors, see the Carrara marble, look into the pier mirrors that create the illusion of a room extending to infinity. The illusion was always the point. And Longwood stands 2 miles south of downtown, behind a screen of old live oaks, exactly as it has stood since 1862. The exterior is complete: the dome, the verandas, the columns, the red brick. The basement, where the Nutt family lived for 35 years, is furnished and open to visitors. Above it, 5 floors of bare timber and exposed brick rise into the rotunda, open to the dome. The workmen's tools are still there. The temporary staircase they built is still there. The paint buckets, the carpenter's plane, the hand-forged nails, all still on the floor where they were set down when the men from Philadelphia heard the news, put on their coats, and walked away from the richest city in America. Longwood was designed to hold 32 rooms. It has held 8 for 160 years. From the top of the dome, if you could reach it, you would see the Mississippi curving south through the bottomlands, the same view the Natchez people saw, the same view the French commandant saw from Fort Rosalie, the same view the cotton planters saw when they stood on the bluff and believed that this would last forever. The river is still there. It still carries barges loaded with grain and steel and petroleum. It still floods in spring. It still curves past the bluff where the richest people in America once lived, in a town most Americans have never heard of.